A rich man kicks a dying dog on a white beach, laughing as a little boy collapses in the sand. The boy screams, the dog bleeds, and the sea keeps silent like nothing matters. Then a Navy SEAL on vacation steps between evil and innocence without hesitation. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The white beach of Clearwater stretched under the harsh noon sun, salt in the air, heat rising in trembling waves from the sand, where tourists walked freely, and one small boy moved with quiet purpose along the shoreline. Lucas worked with the seriousness of someone far older than 10. While others searched for shells or laughter, he searched for bottles, plastic, anything that could be traded for a few coins. Each step he took in the sand carried the weight of months of struggle, of mornings watching his mother pretend strength behind tired eyes, of nights counting bills that never grew smaller. He understood survival in simple arithmetic. If he found enough trash today, they would eat tomorrow without fear. That was the rule he lived by now. Trailing behind him was Max, not just a dog, but the last breathing memory of his father. The man had been a soldier once. Lucas barely remembered the uniform, but remembered the hands that lifted him high, the voice that promised protection even when the world felt cruel. When the folded flag arrived at their door, Max came with it. Since then, the dog had become Lucas's constant shadow, his shield in a world that no longer felt safe. Max walked with a quiet alertness that did not belong to a house pet. Even in stillness, he carried the echo of training passed down by instinct and loyalty born from loss. Lucas bent to pick up a crushed soda can near a stretch of private beach where umbrellas stood like silent guards. That was when the laughter reached him. Not the carefree laughter of vacationers, but the sharper kind, edged with contempt. Richard Collins stood a few steps away, shoes clean where the sand met the manicured edge of privilege. He was a man accustomed to obedience and insulated from consequence, and boredom was his most dangerous companion. "What's that smell?" Richard said loudly, eyes fixed on Lucas as if the boy were the source of the sea itself. The men with him did not laugh because the joke was clever. They laughed because he expected it. Lucas froze. He had learned that sometimes stillness was safer than defense. He lowered his gaze but kept hold of the trash bag, his knuckles whitening around the thin plastic. Richard walked closer, and with a casual flick of his foot, sent the bag tumbling across the sand. Bottles scattered, glass catching the sun like fragments of broken stars. "Pick it up," Richard said. "Clean it properly. If you're going to be garbage, at least be useful." Lucas moved on instinct, not courage, dropping to his knees to gather the mess. That was when the bucket came. Heavy with wet sand, it tipped over his head without warning. The weight knocked him sideways, and the grit filled his mouth, ears, and eyes. The humiliation burned worse than the scrape of shells against his skin. Laughter burst around him, loud and unrestrained. Before Lucas could even cry out, Max moved. The dog placed himself directly between the boy and the men, body tense, voice low, not in wild aggression, but in warning. To Max, this was not an insult. This was a threat, and threats were answered. Richard's face twisted, less in fear than in offense. "Get that thing away from me," he snapped. Lucas reached blindly for Max, his hand shaking, but he was too slow. Richard did not think. He reacted the way men do when power has lived in them for too long. His leg drew back and slammed forward with violent precision. The kick struck the side of Max's head with a hollow sound that silenced even the waves for a breath. Max collapsed into the sand, not in submission, but in shock. Blood appeared quickly, darker than the wet sand that clung to his body. Lucas screamed. The sound tore out of him without control, raw and helpless, as he crawled to Max and wrapped his arms around the trembling body. His hands shook as if trying to hold the dog together by will alone. "Don't hurt him," he cried, not as a demand but as a broken prayer. Richard lifted his leg again, not because Max had moved, not because there was danger, but because cruelty, once unleashed, often seeks a second breath. That was when the shadow fell between them. Ethan had been watching from farther down the beach, sitting alone with the weight of silence pressed heavily across his shoulders. He had chosen Clearwater not for peace, but for distance, from memories that followed him even when his eyes were open. The sea had not quieted them. The sun had not burned them away. But the scream cut through everything. When Richard's leg lifted again, it never came down. Ethan's hand locked around it mid-air with a force that translated something more than strength. It carried certainty. It carried finality. "Step back," Ethan said quietly. Richard tried to pull free. He couldn't. Fear flickered for the first time across his face, quick and unwanted. Ethan released him, not with a shove, but with indifference. Richard stumbled backward, suddenly unsure of his audience, of his authority, of himself. Ethan moved immediately to Lucas and Max. He knelt in the sand without concern for the eyes around them and checked the dog with swift, practiced hands. There was no panic in him, only precision shaped by too many moments when hesitation meant death. Max whimpered, but his eyes remained open, locked not on Ethan, but on Lucas, as if the boy were the anchor keeping him in the world. "You did right," Ethan said softly to the dog, though Max likely did not understand the words. The tone was enough. He looked up once at Richard. Nothing in his gaze promised forgiveness. People had begun to gather at a distance now. Some filmed, some whispered, none intervened. That, Lucas would realize years later, was one of the most painful lessons of that day. Ethan lifted Max carefully and turned to the frightened boy standing unsteadily in the sand. "What's your name?" "Lucas," he whispered. "Come with me, Lucas." There was no command in the words. There was no pressure. Only an offer of safety that Lucas had not felt in a long time. He followed because there was nothing left to do but follow. Behind them, Richard shouted threats that scattered uselessly into the wind. None of them landed, not on Ethan, not on the boy who had already lost far worse. As they moved away from the shoreline, Lucas looked once over his shoulder at the sand, where his shame had been poured out like a joke, then at Max in Ethan's arms, still breathing, still alive. Something inside him that had been quietly shrinking for months paused its retreat. Not hope yet, but resistance. The white beach behind them remained bright and indifferent, but for the first time that day Lucas was walking away from it instead of shrinking beneath it. And somewhere between the crash of the waves and the steady rhythm of Ethan's footsteps, the shape of what this day would become had already begun. The road along the coast curved through rows of swaying palms and half-abandoned motels where salt had eaten into the paint and time had thinned the crowds to whispers, and it was here that Ethan drove with one hand steady on the wheel and the other braced beneath Max's trembling body, as Lucas, sat rigid beside them, unsure whether to cry or to stay silent out of fear of breaking something fragile inside himself. The boy had never been in a stranger's car before, not without his mother, and now everything felt unreal as the roar of waves faded behind them and the beach where his dignity had been crushed shrank into the rear mirror as nothing more than a smear of white and glare. Max struggled to stay awake, not from pain alone, but from the instinct to remain vigilant even while broken, and Ethan felt the tension in the animal's body through every shallow breath as if the dog were fighting a quiet war inside himself. Lucas kept one hand pressed against Max's chest the way his father once taught him to check for breathing after storms when the power went out, and every slight falter sent panic rippling through him until Ethan spoke without looking over, steady and calm, telling him the dog was still with them and that as long as he stayed warm and breathing, they were winning. The words settled into Lucas not as comfort, but as instruction, something to be followed with discipline rather than hope. They reached the clinic on the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the air began to smell more of pine than salt, and Ethan carried Max inside, while Lucas hovered in the doorway, afraid that the threshold itself might be too much for what remained of his world. Dr. Thomas Reed emerged from the back without urgency, but with immediacy, the way men do when they have seen too much panic to mirror it. And though Lucas did not know his history, he felt instinctively that this was a man shaped by long nights and hard decisions. Thomas guided Ethan to the examination table with practiced brevity and began assessing Max's injuries with quiet efficiency, asking only essential questions while his hands worked with familiarity born from years of stitching flesh back into function, human and animal alike. Lucas stood frozen at the foot of the table, watching blood disappear under cloth and clean water, watching Max's eyes follow him even as they dulled with sedative, and the boy felt a ache too complex to name forming in his chest as if he were losing his father all over again in slower motion. Ethan stepped back when told to and watched as the door to the operating room closed between Lucas and the only family he had left. And in that moment he saw the same look he had once worn himself in a desert corridor when one door had closed and taken half his team with it. In the small waiting area that smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee, Lucas finally began to speak, not because Ethan pressed him, but because fear loosens words when silence becomes unbearable. He told of his father who used to carry him on his shoulders when he was smaller and who taught him to watch the tide instead of the crowds because the tide never saw poverty or shame, only movement and return. He told of the folded flag, the knock at the door, and the way his mother had gone quiet afterward in a way that never truly lifted. Max had arrived 2 days later with military escorts who spoke carefully and avoided holding the boy's eyes, and from that moment the dog had become something more than a companion. He had become a promise that one part of his father had survived the long distance between war and home. While Lucas spoke, Ethan felt the echo of his own past vibrate under the surface of the boy's words, and with it the familiar weight of responsibility he had tried to set aside by choosing leave and distance and the illusion of rest. The boy's story pulled that weight back into his hands without asking permission. Hours passed, with the uneven rhythm that waits always bring, measured by footsteps in the hallway and murmured updates from unseen rooms, until Thomas returned with the quiet, tired confirmation that Max would live but would need time and careful protection to walk as he once had. Relief did not arrive as joy for Lucas, but as collapse, the kind that makes the body shake when the mind has held itself rigid too long. He cried without sound, shoulders tight and breath breaking in short gusts, as if he had forgotten how to exhale, and Ethan knelt beside him not as a rescuer, but as a witness, placing a steady hand at the boy's back in a gesture that carried no promises beyond presence. When they were allowed to see Max again, he lay wrapped in bandages and wires that hummed softly with borrowed life. And when he opened his eyes, Lucas leaned forward without thinking and whispered that they were still together, that they were not done yet. Max did not lift his head, but his tail moved once in weak agreement, and in that small motion Ethan felt something inside his own chest respond with a pressure he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. By evening, the sky outside the clinic had darkened into the bruised colors of distant storms, and Lucas's mother had not yet arrived because she had been working double shifts at the fish processing plant beyond the harbor, where calls were forbidden and news traveled only after hours. Ethan made the decision without formal declaration that they would not return to the shoreline or the streets that night, not because he feared Richard's shadow in any immediate way, but because he had seen too many situations where power moved faster than justice once silence took hold. He moved them to his cabin beyond the dredged canals where the road narrowed and the light thinned, a place he had chosen for isolation rather than refuge, but which now shifted purpose without asking whether he was ready. Lucas watched the trees close around them with apprehension, born from an unfamiliar quiet, and Max stirred at the unfamiliar scent of pine and earth that replaced salt and oil. That night, Ethan sat awake near the window with his back to the wall, and his thoughts divided sharply between the boy sleeping uneasily in the next room and the type of man Richard Collins had proven himself to be in the open sunlight. And he knew with soldier certainty that darkness would only sharpen what daylight had already revealed. The next morning brought no peace. A vehicle slowed near the cabin long enough to mark presence without confrontation and then moved on. And when Ethan checked beneath his Jeep, he found the small magnetic device blinking faintly with purpose, a silent confession that yesterday's cruelty had not been impulse alone, but the visible edge of something more deliberate. Lucas watched from the porch as Ethan crushed the tracker in his hand and felt something shift again inside himself as he realized that protection did not always come in the shape of police or crowds, but sometimes in the shape of one man who refused to turn away even when rest had been earned. That night, Max lifted his head for the first time without prompting and faced the door with the quiet vigilance of memory, and Lucas understood that the world had not finished testing them yet, only that the rules of the test had now changed. The morning arrived over Clearwater wrapped in thin mist and distant gull cries, the kind of quiet that feels temporary, as if the world were holding its breath between one act and the next. Ethan woke before dawn out of habit rather than rest, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of wind in pines instead of waves on open sand, and for a moment he almost believed the trouble of the previous day had been nothing more than a fevered distortion of memory until he heard Max shift within the cabin and Lucas stir softly in the adjoining room. Reality settled back into place without violence, steady and undeniable. Max was alive, injured, but breathing. Lucas was sleeping with the guarded exhaustion of a child who had spent too many hours afraid. And outside, beyond the tree line and the curve of the dirt road, the rest of the world was already moving without them. Ethan rose, checked the perimeter in silence, and brewed coffee that went mostly untouched as he replayed the expressions he had seen on the beach, not the laughter, not the cruelty, but the certainty in Richard Collins' eyes when he believed consequences were optional. Men like that did not wake up changed. They woke up calculating. By the time sunlight filtered between the branches, the knock came. It was not the frantic pounding of fear or urgency, but the measured, polite strike of someone who believed doors existed to obey him. Ethan stepped outside before Lucas could wake, closing the door behind him with the controlled quiet of long training. Two men waited by the edge of the clearing. One wore the patience of authority earned through paperwork rather than impact. The other, the restless energy of hired certainty. The first introduced himself as Victor Hale, an attorney representing Richard Collins, and delivered the words with a practiced neutrality that suggested he had spoken them many times before in rooms far more expensive than this one. The second said nothing, because his role was not language, but suggestion. Victor spoke of misunderstandings, of unfortunate moments amplified by emotion and misinterpretation. He spoke of how businesses suffered from scandal whether deserved or not, how families could be torn apart by attention they never sought. Finally, he spoke of resolution. A figure was mentioned, not as a bribe but as assistance, enough to change the immediate arithmetic of Lucas's survival and perhaps the future that had been shrinking around him for months. All that was required in return was a signature affirming that yesterday's events had been exaggerated, that no deliberate harm had been committed, that no malice had intended to reach a child. Ethan listened without expression, not because he considered the offer, but because he recognized the speech as a test of character rather than negotiation, and Victor mistook his silence for uncertainty. Behind them, the cabin door opened quietly. Lucas stood watching, barefoot on the porch, eyes moving between the men, and Ethan, with the instinctive alertness of someone who had learned too young that trouble rarely announced itself clearly. Victor noticed him and adjusted his tone with the subtle courtesy reserved for optics. He smiled in a way meant to reassure without revealing motive, and placed the envelope gently on the porch floor as if setting down something too heavy to hand directly. Lucas did not approach it. He knew money by its absence, knew hunger by schedule, but he also knew that some objects carried weight beyond what they contained. When Victor left, Ethan did not touch the envelope. He waited until the engine noise vanished into the distance, then crushed it under his boot without opening it, and dropped it into the trash with the same decisiveness he might have used on a threat. Lucas watched the gesture with confusion rather than relief. Ethan knelt to his level and told him that sometimes people tried to buy silence because they feared what sound could do. Lucas listened carefully, not understanding everything, but absorbing the feeling beneath the words. It was not the lesson his father would have chosen for him, but it was the one the world had delivered. By midday, the tactics shifted. Ethan felt it not through confrontation, but through absence. The road remained empty longer than was natural for a place that bordered supply routes and seasonal traffic. Birds lifted from the underbrush when no footsteps followed, and beneath the jeep, the blink of red had returned where he had already removed one device. This second discovery was no accident, no afterthought. It was insistence. He pulled the tracker free and turned it over in his palm, recognizing design choices meant for faithless persistence rather than simple monitoring. They had expected him to discard it first. They expected him to feel watched. The mistake was assuming that watching alone would be enough. That afternoon, Lucas's mother arrived in a state between panic and restraint, drawn by rumors and pieced together truths that traveled faster through whisper than through reason. Her name was Maria, and she carried quiet strength that had been worn thin by years of endurance rather than shattered by trauma. When she saw Max breathing steadily and Lucas standing upright without fear in his posture, the relief in her did not erupt as sobs, but folded inward as tremor. Ethan watched the two of them reunite not as spectacle, but as confirmation of risk. Wherever he went next, the danger would follow until its source was exhausted. The second visitor arrived before sunset. This time there was no envelope. Officer Mark Doyle stepped hesitantly into the clearing with the tension of a man caught between duty and instruction. He spoke carefully of a complaint filed regarding unlawful restraint and potential abduction. He asked whether all parties were present willingly. Maria stood beside her son and answered before Ethan could that they feared returning home, and that something more than legal confusion was circling them. Doyle listened, uneasy, and said what he could without saying too much. That Richard Collins had already begun arranging his story, that people with influence disliked waiting for narratives they could not control, that certain channels moved faster than the record. When Doyle left, the sky darkened not into storm, but into pressure. Maria understood what the presence of polite authority meant and stepped forward with the envelope still echoing in her thoughts. Her hands trembled as she suggested that perhaps some compromises were necessary for survival. Ethan did not answer immediately. He watched Lucas crouch beside Max, whispering to the dog with the urgent reverence of someone guarding a sacred thing. Then he told Maria that compromise born from fear bred only deeper fear, that men like Richard did not stop when paid. They refined their reach. Maria said nothing. She had lived too long negotiating with circumstances to deny the danger, but she also saw in Ethan's stillness the immovable shape of a decision already made. Night arrived quiet and false. Ethan prepared the cabin not as shelter, but as a controlled environment whose purpose had shifted from protection to readiness. Lucas helped not by instruction, but by instinct, learning where light mattered and where darkness served better. Max rested near the door, pain muted but alert, as if his body remembered what his spirit refused to forget. Maria sat near the stove, holding a cup she did not drink from, listening to the forest breathe in uneven cycles. The first unusual sound did not come from outside, but from the world beyond the trees, the thin electronic whisper of a device waking up where none should exist. Ethan froze, fingertips against the wall, where the faint vibration traveled through wiring rather than air. Someone was testing distance. Someone was verifying proximity. He signaled silence without gesture. Lucas felt the change before he saw it and drew closer to Max without instruction. In that moment, the last fragile assumption of safety dissolved, not with panic, but with clarity. Whatever choice Richard Collins had made after yesterday's humiliation, it had moved beyond money and into motion. And motion unlike threat, does not ask permission before it arrives. Night settled over the forest with slow, heavy breathing, rain gathering beyond the hills, while the cabin stood alone beneath the first shivering wind of the coming storm. Ethan felt the change long before thunder announced it. The air grew dense in a way that pressed against the skin, the way battlefields always did before sound and violence unfolded. He moved without speaking, closing the outer shutters, not for weather, but for concealment, cutting the visible light inside until the cabin became another shadow among pines. Maria watched him with silent question in her eyes, and he answered not with reassurance, but with readiness. Lucas understood the difference even if he could not name it. Fear had returned, but it had changed shape. It was no longer helpless. It was alert. Max stirred near the door, body still aching from injury, yet spirit braced as if the pain were only another obstacle to work around. He lifted his head when a distant engine passed somewhere far below the ridge, not close enough to be threat, yet near enough to be intention. Ethan crouched beside him and rested his hand against the dog's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath skin and bandage, a reminder that courage did not always come in the shape of strength, but often in the shape of refusal to lie down when the world demanded it. The first drops of rain struck the roof without urgency, scattered taps that sounded like fingers testing glass. Maria moved Lucas farther into the cabin, guiding him toward the small inner room where stone walls held colder air but thicker protection. She did not cry. She did not pray. She worked. Ethan noticed that. The most dangerous moments, he had learned, were not when people panicked, but when they went very quiet inside and decided to endure whatever came. Minutes passed without event. The kind of waiting that causes imagination to turn inward and invent enemies where none yet stood. Ethan used the time to check every angle he had prepared earlier that day, each narrow, lazily angled board that would creak under unfamiliar weight, each simple battery alarm hidden beneath bark or stone. Nothing complex, nothing illegal, only warnings, only time. That was all he intended to steal from the night, if he could. The rain thickened. Wind pushed harder. Branches groaned overhead like ships at sea. Then the signal returned, a soft, unfamiliar current in the air, not sound, but pressure, the faint electronic whisper of something calibrating distance. Ethan felt it along the wall again. Through the wires, a tremor too thin for untrained senses, but unmistakable to his. Someone outside had moved from watching to listening. He motioned once toward Maria without looking back. She nodded and drew Lucas into the inner room. The door closed without sound. The approach did not come from the path. It came from the blind side, where undergrowth grew thick and the slope broke sudden before rising again. Ethan had anticipated that. The men who believed themselves hunters rarely followed roads. They believed roads were for prey. The first shadow slipped into the clearing without patience, a lean outline moving low beneath rain and darkness, boots careful yet confident. 3 more followed at staggered distance, spreading to avoid becoming one target, methodical, not amateurs, hired but trained enough to imitate what they feared. Max heard them before Ethan saw them. A low sound formed in his chest, not a bark, but a warning, drawn so deep it vibrated through his ribs. Ethan pressed 2 fingers lightly against the bridge of the dog's muzzle, and the sound cut to nothing, not by command, but by trust. The figures separated near the trees. One reached the rear corner where the ground leveled slightly, and his foot met the first alarm. The sound was soft and ordinary in daylight, a single chime like a bell stirred by wind. In the storm, it cut through rain with terrible clarity. The man froze. The other shifted. Hesitation rippled down their line, and in that ripple Ethan moved. He did not rush them. He flowed. The space he crossed existed only in fragments of thunder and lightning flash. The first man turned just in time to meet Ethan's hand at his wrist. The weapon he carried never finished its rise. The sound that followed was not loud, only a sudden weight, leaving air in an unfamiliar direction as the man folded without ceremony into mud and shadow. Ethan caught him as he fell and lowered him so that even gravity would not announce the removal. The second intruder reacted faster. A beam of thin white light sliced wildly through rain as he searched for the source of his partner's absence. The light found only water and trembling branches. Fear arrived in the narrow gap between his breaths. Ethan met him in that gap. A twist, a jolt. The light dropped into the wet leaves and died. The remaining two moved together now, adjusting tactics, closing toward the cabin with discipline sharpened by the sudden understanding that whatever waited ahead was not what they had been told it would be. The door took the first impact like a drum and held through splintering wood and shattered latch. The second strike broke it inward. Inside, the darkness swallows them. They entered expecting a room. They entered a silence that moved. The third fell before he shouted. The fourth got one step farther, enough to see the outline of Ethan in the gloom, enough to lift his weapon, not enough. The struggle did not sound like battle. There were no screams, no exchange of shouted threat, only breath and impact, and the soft surrender of strength from bodies that suddenly understood they had been measured and found insufficient. When silence returned, it felt louder than the storm. Rain still roared beyond the walls. Wood creaked. Somewhere in the forest, something fled without dignity. Ethan remained still for several long seconds after the last sound ended, listening not for danger, but for absence. Then he moved again, checking each fallen shape without cruelty or triumph, removing tools and intention from hands that no longer held either. None of the men were dead. None had escaped unmarked. That balance was deliberate. He turned toward the inner room. Before he could speak, the door opened, and Lucas stood framed in shadow with Max beside him, the dog standing despite the tremor in his leg, eyes bright with defiant fire. Maria remained behind them, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other steady on her son's shoulder. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The storm filled the space where words would have stood. Lucas looked at the men on the floor, not with horror, but with a careful curiosity that frightened Ethan more than tears would have. Ethan stepped forward and lowered his voice to the smallest compass the night allowed. "It is over for now," but the words felt unfinished, even as he spoke them. From far below the ridge, another engine started, not hurried, not cautious, only patient. Somewhere beyond the reach of rain-washed headlights, intention turned toward them that was not yet visible and not yet ready to retreat. Dawn crept over the soaked tree line with pale, uncertain light, revealing the aftermath of the storm and the quiet violence it had carried to the doorstep of the cabin. Ethan stood just outside the broken doorway as mist lifted slowly from the ground, his body resting, but his mind still moving through every second of the night before, measuring what was finished and what had only just begun. The four men lay bound inside, breathing and conscious enough to understand fear without the shield of bravado, their purpose stripped away as thoroughly as their certainty. Lucas watched them from a distance with Max pressed close at his side, the dog trembling not with weakness, but with the residue of effort, as if his spirit had run farther than his body could yet follow. Maria remained silent behind them, one hand gripping the door frame as though the world itself might shift without warning. No one spoke, not because there were no words, but because the meaning of the moment was too large to be shaped by sound. Ethan turned when he heard the engine before any of them fully recognized it. The vehicle did not approach quickly. It moved with calculated patience, the way men moved when they believed time obeyed them. Two black shapes emerged through thinning fog and slowed near the clearing as if pausing to take inventory of the scene. The first man out carried authority like a habit that no longer required effort. Sheriff Wade Cooper was not a corrupt man by design, but a tired one worn thin by years of choosing which battles he could afford to fight. Authority had taught him compromise more often than courage. He took in the broken door, the bound men, the exhausted faces, and the wounded dog, before asking a single question. His eyes did not rest long on Ethan. They lingered on the others, searching for the path of least resistance. The second man stepped out more slowly. Richard Collins did not look at the storm damage. He did not look at the forest. He did not look at the men who had failed him. He looked only at Ethan with a tight, measured expression that held neither rage nor apology. It was the look of a man who had already begun rewriting the night in his head and believed his version would replace all others. Sheriff Cooper spoke first, with the cautious rhythm of someone entering a room where the floor might not be solid. He asked what had happened. Ethan answered plainly, without performance, without embellishment. He described the intrusion. He showed the weapons that had been brought. He did not accuse. He did not speculate. He told only what he could verify. Maria added what she had seen through shock and fear. Lucas said little, but his silence did not go unnoticed. Children who have learned too early the cost of speaking often carry that lesson in their eyes. Richard stepped forward when the telling ended. His voice was calm and perfectly arranged, as though each syllable had been rehearsed long before any storm arrived. He spoke of concern. He spoke of how his employees had meant to check on the child after reports of possible abduction had reached him. He spoke of fear for public safety. He spoke of misunderstanding and escalation. He never once mentioned the beach. He never once said Max's name. He never once admitted the reason any of this had begun. It was a performance delivered without strain by someone long practiced in rewriting consequence as confusion. Sheriff Cooper listened with eyes that shifted between the two men as though truth could be weighed by posture alone. Ethan watched the calculation in him, not with anger, but with recognition. He had seen it before in distant valleys and crowded operations rooms. The moment when authority decided whether order was more valuable than justice. Cooper turned to the bound men and began to question them carefully. They hesitated first, then spoke what Richard had paid them to speak. Their account aligned too smoothly to be coincidence. Even lies, when rehearsed, possess rhythm. Maria felt the pressure shift and took one step forward in instinctive defense of her son. Her voice trembled but did not break as she spoke of the beach and the kick and the blood in the sand. Richard met her words with gentle regret that never reached his eyes. He suggested stress. He suggested exaggeration born from fear. He suggested that memory often altered itself to lessen shame. The cruelty of that suggestion struck harder than any blow he had delivered with his foot. Lucas stared at Richard with a clarity that surprised even himself. He did not shout. He did not cry. He only said that Max almost died and that his father would not have allowed it. The words were simple and final. For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind Richard's composure. Not guilt, calculation adjusting itself. Sheriff Cooper rubbed his face slowly, caught between stories that could both be made to hold weight in a town where money funded roads and festivals and uniforms. He turned toward Ethan and asked quietly whether there was proof. Not suspicion, not instinct, proof. Ethan nodded once and stepped toward his vehicle. He retrieved a device from beneath the seat, small and indifferent in appearance compared to the gravity it carried. It held the recordings of the clearing from the moment the first chime sounded to the silence after the last man fell. Not cinematic, not dramatic, just undeniable. As the audio played through the thin air, the night replayed itself without mercy. The approach, the break at the door, the commands spoken by men who believed they owned the outcome. Richard did not interrupt. He did not argue. He waited. When the final sound ended, he exhaled slowly and said nothing. Sheriff Cooper closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the tired resignation in his posture hardened into something closer to resolve. He ordered his deputies to take the intruders into custody for assault and unlawful entry pending further investigation. It was the first decision of the morning that did not bend toward convenience. Richard stepped closer at that and placed one hand lightly on the sheriff's arm in a gesture that pretended to be brotherhood. He reminded Cooper of favors and futures and the fragile nature of small-town order. Cooper removed Richard's hand gently. That removal said more than any argument could have. The deputies moved. The men were loaded into vehicles. Their resistance was small and disorganized now that the illusion of protection had cracked. When the last door shut, Richard found himself standing alone in the clearing with Ethan, between him and the only outcome he still believed he could claim. He studied Ethan longer now, searching for the crack where intimidation might still find purchase. He offered a final bargain without words by stepping closer than anyone else would have dared. Ethan did not retreat. Before Richard could speak again, another vehicle arrived behind the patrol cars. Victor Hale emerged with documents already prepared in his hands as though he had known precisely when Quarrel would turn to court. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The papers he carried spoke of restraint orders and accusations already arranged to reverse the direction of blame by morning. Victor offered them to the sheriff with the confidence of someone who had built his career upon the predictable retreat of conscience. Sheriff Cooper took the folder without commitment. He said everything would be reviewed. He said nothing of outcome. It was enough for Richard, for now. As the convoy departed and the forest swallowed the sound of engines once more, Ethan felt the air remain heavy with unfinished weight. The men who had been taken were expendable. The man who had sent them still stood free beneath the rising sun with his resources untouched. Lucas stepped closer to Ethan and looked up at him with a question he did not speak. Ethan rested his hand on the boy's shoulder as Max leaned into their legs with stubborn, protective warmth. The danger had not passed. It had simply changed shape. Far down the road, beyond the trees, Richard Collins paused beside his vehicle and looked back once toward the cabin. The look he carried then was not one of defeat. It was the look of a man who had just decided that patience would be more useful than force. Morning light spread across the forest in quiet layers of gold and pale blue, washing the cabin and the scarred earth before it as if nothing violent had ever taken place there. The world looked ordinary again. That was its most dangerous illusion. Ethan stood on the porch with a cup of cooling coffee in his hand, not drinking, simply watching the way Maria brushed sand from Lucas' hair as they prepared to leave, and how Max tried stubbornly to place weight on a leg that still trembled with the memory of injury. The storm had passed. The aftermath had not. The day unfolded not with sirens or shouting, but with paper and waiting. Sheriff Cooper returned before noon with deputies who no longer avoided eye contact. The weapons taken from the intruders were logged, the men were transferred, statements were recorded again with fewer interruptions. Richard Collins did not appear at the cabin this time. He did not need to. The law moved on its own when it was finally forced to see. The recordings from the night before spread first through official channels, then quietly through the town itself, in the way truth often travels when no longer buried by command. Maria sat at the small table inside the cabin while she repeated her story in calm, careful sentences, no longer searching for permission in the faces around her. Lucas did not speak much. His role was no longer to explain the world to adults. It was only to survive it. By late afternoon, order had begun to replace fear. A temporary injunction was issued barring Richard from approaching the family. News arrived that the men who had broken into the cabin were now cooperating. Protection had shifted from threat to exposure. Even power, when forced into daylight, lost some of its shape. Ethan felt the tension in his body ease, not into relief, but into something quieter and heavier. Responsibility had completed its arc. What remained was choice. They returned to town the next day not as refugees, but as witnesses. The shoreline where Lucas once knelt in sand now stood under patient skies, unchanged, yet altered by memory. People looked at them differently, some with regret, some with admiration, some with the unease that comes when a familiar hierarchy reveals its hollowness. Maria moved through it with steady grace, her posture no longer drawn inward, but aligned around her son. Max walked between them at a measured pace, no longer a symbol of fragility, but of persistence. Children watched him with awe rather than mockery. Lucas did not swell with pride at the change. He simply accepted it as something new he had not asked for, but would learn to carry. The courthouse doors did not open for them that week. Justice moved slower than danger. But the process had begun, and in that beginning there was a truth that did not require verdict to feel real. Richard Collins was no longer untouchable. His voice no longer commanded instant obedience. The town that had once bent around him now leaned instead toward caution and distance. Victor Hale attempted twice more to negotiate. Each time his words arrived thinner, rephrased around urgency rather than inevitability. Each time Ethan declined to participate in the language of bargaining. He had seen where bargains ended. On the fourth night after the storm, Maria packed what little they had brought to the cabin and prepared to return to the small house near the harbor. Fear lingered in her hands as she folded clothes, but it no longer ruled them. Lucas stood at the edge of the clearing with Max, and watched Ethan load his vehicle in silence. The boy had learned by now that some silences were not empty. They were simply full of things that could not yet be spoken without breaking. At the moment of departure, Maria took Ethan's hands in hers with both gratitude and restraint, the kind of touch that thanks without binding. She said that words were too small for what he had done. Ethan answered that protection did not belong to him. It belonged to any man who refused to look the other way. Lucas approached last with Max beside him and stopped, uncertain how a goodbye should be built when no language existed for what had grown between them. Ethan knelt so that his eyes met the boy's without distance. From his pocket he drew a small object wrapped in cloth and placed it gently into Lucas' palm. It was a symbol Ethan had carried across oceans and through smoke and loss. He did not explain it in detail. He told Lucas only that it was a reminder that fear could be effaced and that duty did not always arrive with orders. Lucas closed its fingers around it with solemn care. Max lifted his head and pressed it briefly into Ethan's chest with quiet insistence. The gesture carried no need for reply. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's neck as he had on the night of the storm, and for the last time felt both the bond and the release in the same breath. The road took him away without drama. No one ran after the vehicle. No one cried out. The forest swallowed the sound as it always had, but the space left behind did not feel empty. It felt held. Weeks passed. The hearings began quietly and grew louder as evidence accumulated. Richard Collins did not fall in a single day. Power rarely did, but it fractured. Investments were questioned. Partners withdrew. The man who once kicked a wounded dog on an open beach now moved through hallways under the gaze of recorders and scrutiny. Lucas watched some of this from a distance through news reports he barely understood. He did not need to understand it all. What he understood was simpler. His mother slept without fear. Max ran again without pain. The house by the harbor no longer felt like a place they would be driven from without warning. On a quiet afternoon, when the tide was low and the sand stretched wide and reflective under the sun, Lucas returned to the beach with Max at his side. He walked not to gather what others had left behind, but simply to walk. The place that had once swallowed his dignity now reflected his shadow steadily beside the dog's. He did not kneel. He did not lower his gaze. He stood and watched the horizon, the way his father once taught him, waiting not for danger, but for return. Far beyond the curve of water and distance beyond sight, Ethan moved again under different skies, with the memory of a boy and a dog bound not by rescue, but by shared refusal to yield. Duty had taken him back into motion, but something else traveled with him now, a proof that the war he fought did not always have to speak with weapons. Sometimes it spoke with one hand raised between violence and what it tried to claim. Miracles do not always arrive in flashes of light or thunder from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly through the courage of one person who refuses to step aside, through the innocent faith of a child who dares to hope, and through the loyal heart of a creature that will not abandon love. God does not always reveal himself in the way we expect, but he always sends the right help at the exact moment it is needed most. In our daily lives, the same truth remains. Every act of kindness, every moment we choose to protect instead of ignore, every time we speak for what is right when it is easier to stay silent, these are the small miracles God works through us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and healing. May God bless you and your family, guard your home, strengthen your spirit in difficult times, and fill your life with peace and purpose. Amen.